Okay. Well, it's early Monday morning. I tried to make this thing last night, then the computer didn't work right, which is fairly regular the case with me in this stuff. So let's try again. Okay. So we're working our way back. Remember, last time we did World War II, the Depression, the Roaring Twenties, and World War One. So now we're looking at a period of time called the Progressive Era, right before World War One. It's kind of a complicated period, so we're starting with who tended to be progressives. Tend to be city folks. They're trying to kind of solve the problems of urban America in certain ways. So it tends to be folks who live in the cities. Um, Tend to be folks who are middle class. Uh, A lot of times they were women. Their husbands were off at work, so they weren't thinking about trying to solve these problems. And a lot of times they were riders. All right, now what they're worried about is they're trying to solve the problems of the Gilded Age: inequality, poverty, political corruption, overcrowding in the cities, city problems, child labor. So they're trying to solve these problems, and they feel like they can do it if they just kind of let the country know what's going on. So you had these progressive journalists that were called muckrakers. Teddy Roosevelt gave them the name muckrakers, said they were always focused on the bad stuff. So most famous of the muckrakers was a guy named Upton Sinclair. He wrote a book called The Jungle. It's about the meat packing factories in Chicago. And remember, they had rats running around down there, and they ended up putting the rats and the rat poison on this belt that goes into the meat. And then sometimes they'd cut their fingers off. And there's this really nasty section of this book. And what the book was mainly about an immigrant family in Chicago, but this section of this book really grossed everybody out. And so the result was the FDA, Food Drug Administration, inspects our food and so forth. How the other half lives, FDA be real relevant right now. Any kind of vaccine anybody comes up with for the coronavirus have to go through lots of FDA trials to make sure it works. How the other half lives was a book about urban poverty. It was a picture book by a guy named Jacob Reese. And he took pictures, just took photographs of people living in tenements in the cities and real poor families living in real rundown apartment buildings. And Shame of the Cities was about political corruption in the cities, saying that party bosses ran the cities and for their own benefit, economic benefit, rather than for the good of the people. So progressives believed in democracy, that if people took more power for themselves from the party bosses, the government would improve. I'm sitting out here with my cat, so I'm allergic to my cat, so I apologize for the sniffing sounds. So the initiative was a policy where people would vote, would come up with an idea, then they'd vote on it rather than the leaders coming up with ideas. Referendums when the leaders come up with an idea, but still the people vote on it, so it's still power to the people kind of thing. A recall is when the people kick their leaders out early, kind of like an impeachment for the president, but for a mayor. And the Australian ballot was the secret ballot. Prior to the Australian ballot, everybody knew who you were voting for, so people were kind of intimidated to vote their conscience. Okay, there were three progressive presidents. Teddy Roosevelt's the most famous of them. He came up with something called the Square Deal. It had three C's. The Square Deal had three C's: consumers, corporations, and conservation. Consumers, that's what the FDA was created for. Make sure that your meat didn't have awful things, rat parts and poison and people fingers, that sort of thing. The corporations, he took on the big businesses, sued the trusts 44 times. And conservation, he set aside a lot of land for national parks that couldn't be developed by industry. Taft was the next progressive president. He did more than Roosevelt did. Oh, goodness, cat. Sued more trust. Now my cat thinks I'm playing with him to like scratch me while I'm trying to make this dang thing. All right. Sued more trust, conserved more land um, than Roosevelt did, but the two of them had a falling out, and Roosevelt, stop. Roosevelt ran against him for president. It's got to be the only video where the teacher's cat is scratching him while he's trying to make the video. Conserved more land than Roosevelt did. I'm making gestures so he sees my hand moving around. I keep my hand in my pocket the rest of the time. Okay. So Wilson defeated him, and so Wilson became president. He did something called the Federal Reserve that helps the government regulate the money supply. That helps people who are in debt if you expand the money supply. 4 progressive amendments were passed during the Wilson years. The 16th Amendment's the income tax. The 17th Amendment's direct election of senators. 18th Amendment's prohibition. And the 19th Amendment is women's suffrage. Okay, so there's the progressives. All right, the next period is imperialism. Imperialism is the United States taking over other countries. It's going to start with the Spanish-American War. The reasons for imperialism, generally speaking, is if you take over other countries, that country, generally speaking, is going to have resources that we like. The other countries would have markets, places we could sell our goods. The more, people believe the bigger our empire was, the more powerful the United States was. Other countries had empires. And then social Darwinism, kind of survival of the fittest country. So the cause of the Spanish-American War specifically, Cubans wanted their independence from Spain. The Spanish-American War was fought in Cuba and the Philippines. Sinking of the Maine, it was an American ship off the coast of Cuba, kind of monitoring what was going on in Cuba, and it sunk. And so a group of the media called the Yellow Journalists exaggerated what was going on and claimed that the Spanish had sunk the Maine. The big hero of the Spanish-American War, the Yellow Journalists kind of caused this war, got everybody fired up to go fight. The big hero of the war was Teddy Roosevelt and his military outfit called the Rough Riders. There's a picture of them charging up San Juan Hills, the most famous battle of the war. His military group was made up of like Harvard and Yale college guys he'd gone to college with, and then cowboys that he'd known out west because he had been a cowboy out west in the Dakotas. All right. Roosevelt as president was very much of an imperialist. He had the Panama Canal dug to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean for our boats to go back and forth. Kind of created the country of Panama to do that. His foreign policy was called big stick diplomacy, so it's kind of a macho man in his foreign policy, and the big stick was the American Navy. And the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine said that the American Navy would keep Europe out of Latin America and the Caribbean, basically, even if European countries owed them money. We'd collect the debt and we'd send the money to them. All right, President Taft wanted to go a little easier, wanted to be a little less aggressive, so he had something called dollar diplomacy, where we would invest in other countries. But it wasn't that successful, so if a country did something Taft didn't like, he sent in the military even more than Roosevelt did. And Wilson had something called moral diplomacy, where he'd kind of just try to persuade other countries to do the right thing. He ended up sending the troops to a lot of Latin American countries, in particular Mexico. We were chasing a guy named Pancho Villa all around Mexico when World War I started. Okay, halfway there, so we got 2 more slides. The Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is when the problems come along that the progressives are trying to solve. Kind of starts with the Transcontinental Railroad. That was first big industry was railroad industry, and the first big railroad was the Transcontinental Railroad, going across the continent, built by 2 companies: the Union Pacific that was coming out of Nebraska, and the Central Pacific that was coming out of California. Leland Stanford University is named after the president of, or really the son. He was the founder. Leland Stanford was the founder of Stanford University in Northern California, close to San Francisco. The 2 immigrant groups, immigrants worked long hours, low wages, and dangerous conditions. And so the 2 immigrant groups that worked on this railroad were the Irish for the Union Pacific and the Chinese for the Central Pacific. Then you've got these industrialists, the big industrialists of the Gilded Age. So the railroad man was named Vanderbilt, and hey, they have Vanderbilt University named after him. These guys were philanthropists, and they gave away a lot of money. So he gave away money for a college in Nashville, even though he was from New York, had never been in Nashville. Was friends with a guy from Nashville is basically what happened. But he was a railroad man. His railroad was called the New York Central. Grand Central Station in New York City is named after the New York Central Railroad. Carnegie was the steel man. The railroads, railroads were made out of steel. Skyscrapers made out of steel. So the steel industry really kind of made American industry. The Bessemer process was a process of making steel, blowing cold air. How does it go? Hot air on cold iron, or cold air on hot iron. But at any rate, you look inside the steel mill, it really looks like you're inside hell, kind of. Like you see some of these pictures over here, inside of a steel mill. It's like a volcano or hell. Rockefeller was the president of Standard Oil. Oil wasn't used for cars yet. There weren't any cars. It was used for lighting and for cooking. And his oil was the standard, and oil could be dangerous. If you light up your lamp and the house blows up, that's a problem. So his oil was safer, so he said the standard. And then J.P. Morgan was the leading banker of the area, and he bought Carnegie Steel, renamed it U.S. Steel. These guys had monopolies and trusts, meaning, they would set up a situation where they'd run their competition out of business to where they were the only company in a particular business, or they'd intimidate other companies into kind of doing what they said, and so that's called a trust. The working conditions were rough. The three most famous, so a union was a group of people trying to improve working conditions, a group of workers, and the three most famous unions of the time, one was called the National Labor Union, second one was called the Knights of Labor. Neither one of them were very successful because they let in skilled or unskilled workers. And then the most successful union was the American Federation of Labor, only used skilled workers, and skilled workers couldn't be replaced by scabs. All right. Four most famous strikes. Two of them, the first one and the last one, are railroad strikes. And when railroad workers went on strike, the president could call out the army to put down the strike because the president's got the power to regulate, government's got the power to regulate interstate commerce. The Haymarket Square strike was in Chicago, and Homestead was outside of Pittsburgh. Both of them kind of messed up. When an anarchist did something violent. Anarchists blew up some dynamite, killed some policemen at Haymarket Square, and shot and stabbed the mill owner at Homestead, a guy named Henry Clay Frick. All right, the last one. Okay, Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877. So this is at the end of the Civil War, and it's Reconstruction is rebuilding the South and putting the country back together after the war. Lincoln kind of begins it with his second inaugural address when he gets inaugurated president the second time. Famous for saying, "With malice towards none and charity for all." In other words, he wants to forgive the South for what happened in the war. And presidential Reconstruction, there's two kinds of Reconstruction. The first part of it was presidential Reconstruction, and it was the easy Reconstruction process, didn't really punish the South very much, pretty much forgave the South. So Lincoln's plan was that 10% of people in the state had to pledge allegiance to the United States again, and that they had to ratify the 13th Amendment that ended slavery. So this was the real easy Reconstruction process. When Lincoln was killed, he was replaced by Andrew Johnson, who was a Southerner from Tennessee and very racist president. And so he was letting Southern states back in with black codes that were kind of like slave codes that took away the rights of former slaves, kind of in between the slave codes and segregation laws. Because he was so anti-civil rights, really, he ended up getting impeached. The law he broke was the Tenure of Office Act, but it had more to do with, the Reconstruction process than, Tenure of Office Act said he couldn't fire his cabinet members. Okay, African Americans after the war, former slaves, freedmen they were called. They tended to work as sharecroppers and tenant farmers, and these jobs kept them in debt. And as long as they were in debt, they tended not to be able to leave. The plantation they were still working on, a lot of times the same plantation they'd worked on before the Civil War when they were slaves. The Freedmen's Bureau was a government agency created to help former slaves, and it did. It gave food and education and health care. It didn't give land, and freedmen really needed land so they become independent farmers and not work on the plantation owner's land. All right. Within a couple of years, Congress kind of took over Reconstruction, took control over Reconstruction. Congress was led by a group of people called radical Republicans, and they really, really wanted to change the South. So they were going to have a harsher Reconstruction and a much more pro-civil rights Reconstruction. The radicals were led by a guy named Thaddeus Stevens in the House of Representatives and Charles Sumner in the Senate. One of the laws that Johnson vetoed that they passed was called the Military Reconstruction Act, and it divided the South into 5 military districts rather than states. And so in order to become states, states had to ratify the 14th Amendment, giving former slaves citizenship, and they had to give former slaves the right to vote, which eventually became the 15th Amendment, making permanent African-American men their right to vote. Carpetbaggers and scalawags helped work with Reconstruction. Carpetbaggers came from the North, and scalawags were Southerners. They were awfully unpopular, seen as corrupt, and scalawags were especially hated because they were seen as traitors. The Klan was a terrorist organization that was certainly racist. It also didn't like any Republicans, anybody who helped with Reconstruction. So carpetbaggers and scalawags as well. President Grant, was president during most of Reconstruction. Got elected in 1868 and was a 2-term president and signed laws that got rid of the Klan for a while. The Klan didn't come back till the 1920s. The Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction. The South resented it. The corruption was unpopular. The economy had gone bad. People were mad about the Republicans. And so the Southern Democrat almost got elected president, and it was a disputed election. And so the Compromise of 1877 said the North could have the presidency and there'd be another Republican president, but they had to get out of the South and leave the South alone and pull the troops out of the South. And so that's what brought Reconstruction to an end. Okay, shooting for about 15 minutes there. Hopefully that's what we got. Also, hopefully this one takes.